Mark Kerr. If you were a heavyweight in the late 1990s and you heard the name Mark Kerr called across the ring from you, you had every reason to be afraid. Mark Kerr was not just a fighter. He was a two-time NCAA Division I wrestling champion. He was a two-time UFC tournament winner, and during his peak, he was widely considered the most physically dominant force in the sport. The man stood 6'2". He weighed around 240 pounds of near pure muscle, and his wrestling, it wasn't just good for MMA, it was elite by any standard, anywhere at any level. What made Kerr unstoppable? When Mark Kerr took you down, the fight was essentially over. He had the strength to hold anyone against the mat, pressure to exhaust them into mistakes, and the ground and pound to finish the fight on his own terms. His 1997 and 1998 UFC tournament runs were destruction sequences. He didn't just beat opponents, he dismantled them repeatedly in a single night. In the UFC 14 and UFC 15 tournaments, Kerr went through multiple opponents each time without breaking a sweat that felt earned. He was operating at a level that most of his opponents simply couldn't match physically. He later competed in Pride, where the competition was even fiercer, and while he faced tougher challenges there, his legacy as the man who may have been the most physically gifted heavyweight in early MMA history remains intact. What makes Kerr's story even more compelling and more tragic is the documentary, The Smashing Machine, which followed his career and his personal struggles in detail. Here was a man built like a superhero, battling demons that had nothing to do with fighting. Mark Kerr is proof that the sport's most dominant athletes aren't always its most invincible ones. Outside the ring, one wrestler down, 6 legends to go, and the next man on this list, he didn't need takedowns to end your night. Gary Goodridge. There are highlight reels, and then there is Gary Goodridge. If you've spent more than 10 minutes watching early MMA, you've probably seen it. A fighter mounted in a crucifix position, arms trapped, completely helpless, while Gary Goodridge rains down elbows until the referee has no choice but to stop it. That moment, against Paul Herrera at UFC 8 in 1996, became one of the most replayed clips in MMA history, and it told you everything you needed to know about Gary Goodridge. Goodridge came from a background in arm wrestling. Yes, arm wrestling, which gave him grip strength and upper body power that translated immediately into MMA. He wasn't a trained grappler. He wasn't a trained striker with decades of experience. He was a naturally gifted, explosively powerful athlete who figured out how to hurt people very efficiently. What made him dangerous? Gary Goodridge had one of the most feared right hands in the sport. His knockout power was genuine, not manufactured by perfect technique, but by raw physical ability and timing that was difficult to coach and impossible to fake. In Pride, he became a staple heavyweight who fought absolutely everyone. He faced legends, contenders, and monsters alike. He wasn't always the most polished fighter in the ring, but he was almost always the most dangerous. Goodridge fought in Pride, K1, IFL, and various promotions for over a decade. He competed against Mirko Cro Cop, Don Frye, Yoshihiro Takayama, and a who's who of heavyweight royalty. His fighting style was pure aggression, forward pressure, big shots, the constant threat of something catastrophic happening at any moment. For MMA fans of that era, Gary Goodridge was exactly what you hoped to see every time you tuned in. A man who could end a fight without warning. The legacy. In later years, Goodridge has spoken publicly about his struggles with CTE, a devastating and honest reminder of the cost that era's fighters paid for our entertainment. His courage in sharing that story is as significant as anything he did inside the ring. Now, if Goodridge represents raw knockout power, our next fighter represents something almost supernatural, the ability to survive what should be unsurvivable, and then win. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. There's a story about Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira that has nothing to do with MMA, and it explains everything about who he is. When Nogueira was a child in Brazil, he was run over by a truck. The accident was catastrophic. He spent a long period recovering, underwent multiple surgeries, and by most accounts, should never have been a professional athlete. He became one of the greatest heavyweight fighters in the history of the sport. What defined Nogueira? In a sport full of talented athletes, Nogueira stood apart for two qualities that are nearly impossible to teach: durability, and submission grappling. His Brazilian jiu-jitsu was absolutely elite. Some would argue the best at heavyweight in that era. His ability to work from his back, to find submissions from positions that looked desperate, to survive absolutely brutal punishment, and still threaten finishes, it was unlike anything MMA fans had seen before. The Fedor fight. Nogueira fought Fedor Emelianenko 3 times. Let that sink in. He fought arguably the greatest heavyweight in MMA history, a man who, at his peak, felt genuinely unstoppable 3 separate times. He lost all 3, but in their first encounter, he took damage that would have stopped most men cold, and he kept hunting for submissions. He came closer to finishing Fedor than almost anyone ever did. The Bob Sapp fight. His fight against Bob Sapp at Pride Shockwave 2002 is one of the most iconic in MMA history. Sapp, a 350-pound athletic freak, dominated Nogueira for stretches of the fight in ways that looked almost comical in terms of size and power. And Nogueira survived and won by submission. It was the kind of performance that makes you believe in something beyond physical ability. Nogueira went on to become Pride Heavyweight Champion. He later won the UFC Interim Heavyweight title. He fought for over 2 decades at the highest levels of the sport. But more than any title, what he left behind was a template for how heart, technique, and will can overcome nearly any physical disadvantage. Our next fighter took a different path to legendary status. He was less about surviving and more about systematically destroying you with one of the most reliable weapons in the sport. Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson did 2 things better than almost anyone in MMA history. He wrestled at an Olympic level, and he hit people with his right hand in a way that made highlight reels out of previously respectable careers. Henderson was a 2-time Olympian in Greco-Roman wrestling for the United States. That pedigree alone would make him dangerous, but what elevated Hendo into the conversation of all-time greats was the right hand, nicknamed the H-bomb, that he threw with unusual torque, unusual timing, and unusual finishing power. What made him elite? The genius of Dan Henderson as a fighter was the combination. You couldn't just defend his wrestling because the moment you got too preoccupied with it, the right hand was coming. And you couldn't just watch for the right hand because then he'd take you down. This combination, at a world-class level in both areas, made him one of the most complete fighters of his era. Multi-division dominance. Henderson competed at middleweight and light heavyweight. He won the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. He challenged for the UFC Light Heavyweight title. He defeated elite fighters at both weight classes, a level of versatility that most fighters never achieve. The Bisping KO. If you haven't seen the Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping knockout from UFC 100, stop this video right now and go find it. We'll wait. Welcome back. That was the H-bomb in its purest form. The legacy. Dan Henderson competed at a high level well into his late 30s and early 40s, a testament to the durability and athleticism that an elite wrestling base provides. He was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, and his place in the pantheon of the Pride era is absolutely secure. Now we move from calculated destruction to pure, emotional, explosive chaos. And nobody brought that chaos quite like our next fighter, Rampage Jackson. Quentin Jackson didn't just fight, he performed. He entertained, he terrified, and then he slammed you into the canvas so hard that the crowd didn't just cheer, they screamed. The slam of Ricardo Arona at Pride Final Conflict 2004 might be the most dramatic finish in the history of the sport. Arona had Rampage in a triangle choke, squeezing the life out of him, and Rampage powered up, lifted a 205-pound man completely off the ground, and drove him into the mat with every ounce of force he had. Arona was out cold before he hit the ground. The arena in Japan lost its mind. What made Rampage special? Jackson was a perfect combination of athleticism, aggression, and personality. He came forward constantly. He threw with bad intentions, and his wrestling, while not his primary weapon, was freakishly strong when he chose to use it. His trash talk and pre-fight personality made him one of the most compelling figures in combat sports. But it was what happened inside the ring that built the legend. The Chuck Liddell rivalry. Rampage and Chuck Liddell fought twice, and we'll talk more about Liddell in a moment. But their rematch, in which Jackson knocked out Liddell to win the UFC light heavyweight title, was one of the most anticipated results in the sport's history. It validated everything Pride fans had been saying for years. Quinton Jackson became a cultural figure beyond MMA. Movies, television, a broader pop culture footprint. But for those who watched him in Pride, the memory is simpler. A man who made every fight feel like something you never forget. By the way, if you're enjoying this breakdown so far, go ahead and drop a like on the video right now. It genuinely helps us reach more fight fans who love this kind of content. Takes 1 second. Back to it. Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson did two things better than almost anyone in MMA history. He wrestled at an Olympic level, and he hit people with his right hand in a way that made highlight reels out of previously respectable careers. Henderson was a two-time Olympian in Greco-Roman wrestling for the United States. That pedigree alone would make him dangerous. But what elevated Hendo into the conversation of all-time greats was the right hand, nicknamed the H-bomb, that he threw with unusual torque, unusual timing, and unusual finishing power. What made him elite? The genius of Dan Henderson as a fighter was the combination. You couldn't just defend his wrestling because the moment you got too preoccupied with it, the right hand was coming. And you couldn't just watch for the right hand because then he'd take you down. This combination at a world-class level in both areas made him one of the most complete fighters of his era. Multi-division dominance. Henderson competed at middleweight and light heavyweight. He won the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. He challenged for the UFC light heavyweight title. He defeated elite fighters at both weight classes, a level of versatility that most fighters never achieve. The Bisping KO. If you haven't seen the Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping knockout from UFC 100, stop this video right now and go find it. We'll wait. Welcome back. That was the H-bomb in its purest form. The legacy. Dan Henderson competed at a high level well into his late 30s and early 40s, a testament to the durability and athleticism that an elite wrestling base provides. He was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, and his place in the pantheon of the Pride era is absolutely secure. Now we move from calculated destruction to pure, emotional, explosive chaos. And nobody brought that chaos quite like our next fighter, Kevin Randleman. Kevin Randleman was one of the most physically gifted human beings to ever compete in mixed martial arts. And the full story of what he accomplished and what kept him from becoming an undisputed legend is one of the most fascinating in the sport. Randleman was a two-time NCAA Division I wrestling champion at Ohio State, the same university that produced Dan Henderson and other elite combat sports athletes. He was explosive, he was powerful, and his athleticism was the kind that made coaches and opponents stare in disbelief. The Fedor Slam. If you know one Kevin Randleman moment, it's the slam of Fedor Emelianenko at Pride Critical Countdown 2004. Randleman picked up Fedor, one of the most feared heavyweights in history, and drove him headfirst into the canvas with a slam that should have ended the fight, and possibly the career. Fedor survived, got back up, and submitted Randleman shortly after. That sequence, the slam, the survival, the reversal, is perhaps the single most remarkable 30-second stretch in MMA history. The wrestling to MMA gap. What prevented Randleman from reaching the absolute pinnacle was the gap between his wrestling and his finishing ability. He could dominate positioning, he could control fighters, but converting that dominance into stoppages consistently against elite opposition proved to be the missing piece. Still, Kevin Randleman competed against the best in the world for over a decade. He held the UFC Heavyweight Championship. He fought in Pride, beating and challenging the sport's elite. His combination of athletic gifts and wrestling credentials puts him in rare company. And that one moment, the Fedor Slam, ensures his name will be remembered as long as people watch this sport. One fighter left, and this one, more than perhaps anyone else on this list, represents what this era looked and felt like to the fans who lived through it. Chuck Liddell. There is a specific version of mixed martial arts that Chuck Liddell almost single-handedly created in the minds of mainstream America. It was aggressive, it was violent, it was exciting, and it was built entirely around the idea that Chuck Liddell was going to walk forward and knock you out. Chuck Liddell had no business being as hard to take down as he was. He was a striker. His primary background was in Kempo karate and kickboxing, but his takedown defense was built on wrestling knowledge from Cal Poly, and the combination produced something that changed the sport, the Iceman style. What Liddell understood before most fighters did was that the most dangerous place in a stand-up MMA fight was moving backward. He stayed upright, kept his hands low, which looked reckless but was actually calculated, and dared opponents to come at him. When they did, he countered with overhand rights and left hooks that redefined what a knockout in MMA looked like. The reign. From 2004 to 2007, Chuck Liddell was the UFC light heavyweight champion and the most recognized face in the sport. He headlined cards that broke pay-per-view records. He defeated Randy Couture twice. He beat Tito Ortiz. He beat Renato Sobral, Vernon White, and Alistair Overeem. He was, for a specific window of time, the biggest star in combat sports in America. The PR connection. Liddell also competed in Pride, fighting Wanderlei Silva in a fight that felt like two immovable forces colliding. The result, a Liddell loss, only added to the mythology of both men. When people talk about the era that turned MMA from a niche spectacle into a mainstream sport, Chuck Liddell's face is almost always in the frame. He wasn't just a champion, he was a symbol. The Iceman didn't just fight in the brutal era of MMA, he was its face. Conclusion. 7 fighters, 7 different stories, 7 different definitions of what it meant to be elite. Mark Kerr showed us what physical dominance could look like when it operated without limits. Gary Goodridge showed us that knockout power is a language everyone understands, regardless of technique. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira showed us that heart and jiu-jitsu can survive anything, and then finish you from the bottom. Dan Henderson showed us what a perfect combination of wrestling and striking looks like when it's built on Olympic-level foundation. Quinton Jackson showed us that personality and performance are not separate things. They feed each other. Kevin Randleman showed us that athletic gifts by themselves can make a man legendary, even when the results don't always follow. And Chuck Liddell showed us what happens when a striker refuses to go backward, refuses to compromise, and builds an entire fighting identity on the courage to stand and deliver. These men competed during one of the most violent and unregulated periods in the evolution of mixed martial arts. They didn't have the coaching infrastructure, the nutritional science, the sports psychology, or the rules protections that today's fighters benefit from. They had their training, their heart, and each other. And out of those battles, in Pride arenas in Japan, in UFC cages in America, in venues around the world, they built a sport. The sport you watch today exists in part because these 7 men were willing to compete when nobody really knew what the rules were. That's not nothing, that's everything. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely, it means you care about this sport the same way we do. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time. We cover the history, the legends, and the stories that made combat sports what it is. Hit subscribe, leave a comment below telling me which of these 7 fighters you think was the most complete, and I'll see you in the next one.